They showed up in daylight with fake badges and a bulldozer and tore down my brother's house without warning. HOA orders, they claimed. But there was no HOA, just a bitter old man playing cop in a quiet neighborhood. What happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. My brother, Kyle Jenkins, is the kind of man who breathes purpose into every corner of his life. Quiet, deliberate, and fiercely independent. He doesn't talk much about the years he spent overseas, contracting on military bases, building in the middle of war zones where nothing was guaranteed but the sweat on your palms and the weight of your choices. When he finally came home, he didn't look for comfort. He looked for work. Not the kind that pays with checks, but the kind that roots you into the earth and tells you, this is yours. He found it in a battered, half-rotted house at the edge of a tree-lined cul-de-sac in suburban Virginia, a leftover project from a foreclosure auction, the kind most folks would have walked away from without a second glance. But Kyle saw bones. He saw a skeleton waiting to stand proud again. Over the next 2 years, he rebuilt that house the way a sculptor chips away at marble, layer by layer, mistake by mistake, until only intention remains. He didn't just swing hammers. He rewired, replumbed, and reframed everything with the precision of someone who'd built airstrips under sniper fire and laid foundations with a stopwatch ticking down behind him. The locals didn't understand him, not really. They smiled, waved, and gossiped behind their blinds about the quiet guy who worked past sunset and didn't come to neighborhood barbecues. But Kyle didn't need their approval. That house was his monument to peace after years of sand and steel. He slept under the rafters he raised. He ate on the porch he built. That home was him. So when my phone rang just after 10 a.m. on a gray Thursday and Kyle's voice cracked with something close to panic, my heart dropped like a cinder block. "They're tearing it down," he said. "My house, right now." The word didn't compute at first. Tearing? Down? I was out the door before I could ask a second question. By the time I pulled up, the air was filled with dust, the front wall already a pile of splintered studs and drywall. Men in reflective vests and embroidered jackets moved like ants over a carcass, all smug efficiency. One held a clipboard. Another leaned against a cat excavator like he was posing for a magazine. A sheet of paper flapped against a post. HOA violation notice. Immediate enforcement. Fake legalese and bold red letters. My pulse thundered. I stepped out, demanded answers. The bald man with aviators barely glanced at me before tossing his line like a rehearsed joke. Non-compliant structure. Orders from the HOA board. But Kyle isn't in an HOA, I snapped. He smirked, and that smirk burned itself into my memory like a brand. That's not up to him anymore. Turns out the HOA board was less of a governing body and more of a delusion with a mailing list. When Kyle bought his lot 3 years ago, the neighborhood had no association, no rules, no dues, no architectural review nonsense. Just a handful of homes, most of them old, some neglected, and none under any covenant. That changed when Gerald Crane moved in. Gerald wasn't dangerous in the traditional sense. He was retired, brittle around the edges, and still clung to the memory of his days patrolling the local mall like it was a war zone. But retirement had left him idle, and men like Gerald don't cope well with idle. He needed something to command, something to conquer, and he found it in the form of a quiet, unregulated neighborhood that, in his mind, needed order. He started small, flyers in mailboxes, friendly reminders about lawn height and garbage day decorum. Then came the printed membership invitations, styled like legal documents but riddled with spelling errors. They looked official enough to scare the elderly and the indifferent into compliance. Within 6 months, Gerald had wrangled a group of 6 other retirees into his fantasy regime. They wore matching windbreakers embroidered with NCE in bold block letters. Their equipment? Cheap walkie-talkies from a truck stop, clipboards and laminated lanyards bearing fake credentials printed off a home inkjet. They called themselves the Neighborhood Compliance Enforcers. As if that meant something. Kyle, naturally, laughed them off the first time they showed up at his property with suggestions. He was polite, told them he appreciated their concern, but that his house wasn't subject to any HOA jurisdiction. Gerald didn't take that well. To him, non-compliance wasn't just resistance, it was defiance, and Kyle's refusal, especially coming from a man younger, stronger, and clearly uninterested in playing along, pricked a raw nerve in Gerald's ego. That nerve festered into something darker. The warnings escalated into written threats, citations for non-existent violations, fines backed by fabricated bylaws. Kyle ignored them, knowing they had no legal ground. But Gerald didn't care about legality. He cared about control. And when Kyle left town briefly to pick up a shipment of reclaimed wood from Richmond, Gerald saw his opportunity. Armed with nothing more than forged paperwork and a twisted sense of entitlement, the NCE showed up like a rogue SWAT team. They declared Kyle's structure unsafe, called in a local demolition crew, one that had done a few cash jobs for Gerald's son-in-law, and set about erasing the home Kyle had poured years of his life into. It was daylight theft under the mask of authority. When I stood beside Kyle amid the debris, I expected rage, shouting, maybe even tears. But instead, he just stared at the splintered frame of what used to be his front door and whispered like he was remembering an oath from another life. They want war? Let's give them a proper one. And that's when I realized Gerald hadn't just made a mistake. He'd declared war on the wrong damn man. What Gerald Crane didn't realize, and what would dismantle his entire fantasy of power, was that Kyle Jenkins wasn't some passive tradesman content to lick his wounds and rebuild quietly. Behind the calloused hands and calm demeanor was a man forged by war zones, one who had laid down bridges under fire and rebuilt forward operating bases from ashes. Kyle wasn't just a builder. He was a former military engineer, the kind of man who measured consequences like others measure wood, precisely, methodically, and always with a plan. And one of the only people he trusted more than himself? Major General Thomas Hawk Kessler, a longtime friend, former commanding officer, and now one of the top strategists in the Department of Defense's Domestic Response Division. Their bond wasn't casual. It had been hardened in the heat of real emergencies, where failure meant body bags and headlines. So when Kyle reached out and laid out what had happened, fake authority, forged documents, and illegal demolition of a veteran's home, the general didn't hesitate. He didn't need convincing. He needed coordinates. 72 hours later, the silence of the cul-de-sac shattered under the low hum of unmarked black SUVs with tinted windows and federal plates. Men and women in plain clothes but unmistakably official stepped out, scanning the wreckage with sharp eyes and tighter jaws. These weren't local code inspectors or city officials. They were federal investigators from agencies that didn't bother knocking when they had probable cause. And they had plenty. They canvassed the site with surgical precision. Every forged HOA letter, every piece of uniform, every fraudulent signature was photographed, bagged, and cataloged. They visited homes, took witness statements, and reviewed months of correspondence. It turned out Gerald's little dictatorship wasn't just petty, it was criminal. The fake IDs, the false representation of government authority, the coerced dues, it all added up to a federal case. Not civil, criminal. At 6:43 the next morning, Gerald was yanked from his home in a pair of slippers and a camouflage bathrobe, still clutching his fake badge as if it would protect him. It didn't. That badge was confiscated. His fraudulent bylaws? Seized and publicly torn apart by a grim-faced JAG officer who read every line aloud before shredding it in front of a witness panel. The demolition company, which had failed to verify any authorization, faced six-figure fines and immediate shutdown. Then came the final reckoning. General Kessler, pressed uniform immaculate, combat ribbons catching the sun, stood before the neighborhood that had watched this farce unfold. With the steady voice of a man who had addressed battle-hardened troops, he laid it all bare. This country doesn't run on fake authority and playground bullies. If you want to enforce something, earn it the right way, not by destroying a veteran's home. There was no applause, just silence. Heavy, humbling. Justice hadn't knocked politely. It had rolled in with steel and resolve. There's a quiet kind of victory that doesn't need fireworks or fanfare. It lives in the unspoken weight of a gaze, the resolute line of a man's shoulders, and the slow, deliberate beat of a flag catching wind in the morning sun. That was Kyle's victory. His house, once a splintered memory, rose again. Only this time, it stood not just as a home, but as a monument. It was broader across the foundation, taller in its frame and bolder in design. The paint was fresh, the lines sharp, but every detail held the defiance of a man who refused to be erased. He didn't hire a construction crew from the phone book. The people who showed up brought more than tools. They brought respect. Veterans from the local post, some with fading ink on their arms and stories in their eyes, lent their strength without needing to be asked. Neighbors who'd once kept to themselves knocked on his door, asking where to start. Even a few kids pitched in, hauling scrap and painting railings under the watchful eyes of old men who'd once led platoons through mud and gunfire. Government assistance came too, but not with speeches or press. It came in the form of permits expedited without red tape, inspectors who showed up early and left satisfied, and a quiet envelope of funds that no one ever spoke about out loud. It was the kind of support that tells you someone, somewhere, made a phone call and said, "Make this right." Quietly, completely. And when it was done, when the last nail was driven and the last coat dried, Kyle planted a steel flagpole at the front edge of the lawn, reinforced in concrete. 2 flags flew there, the stars and stripes at the top. Below it, a bold white banner on black. "We don't serve tyrants." Gerald Crane, meanwhile, was a ghost in the community he once tried to rule. The investigation loomed like a storm cloud, and the charges, impersonation, fraud, criminal mischief, destruction of property, carried a combined weight of up to 15 years. The NCE disbanded without ceremony. Their uniforms disappeared. Their radios went silent. Most couldn't even look Kyle in the eye. And Kyle? He never gloated, never smirked or boasted or rubbed salt in wounds. He simply stood on that new porch most evenings, arms folded, posture relaxed, nodding once when neighbors walked by with something different in their smiles. Respect, gratitude, maybe even a little awe. Justice hadn't whispered. It had spoken through action, and for once it had spoken loud enough for everyone to hear.